Just like that, a wild weekend of basketball has come to an end. But before we can move on to the next stage, we got to look back and recap some of the best moments that we've seen from the first two rounds of March Madness. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to Seb Central. Today we're going to go through some of the best moments that we've seen from the first two rounds of March Madness. I'll be recapping each region at a time, so if you want to skip to a particular region or particular team, there'll be timestamps down below for you to want to keep up with that. But for now, let us begin with the East region. Now for me, the first thing that comes to mind when talking about this region has to be the number one seed Duke, who survived a big scare in the first round against the Siena Saints, winning just 71-65 in a game that they were trailing for basically the majority of it. A huge shout out goes to Jerry McNamara, who put on an absolute clinic in that game, so much so that Jon Scheyer came out of the game and said that he was wildly outcoached by him. I'm definitely interested to see what holds up for him in the future, as he just accepted the job as to become the next Syracuse head coach. But for him to get his team to that point, taking a 13-point lead at the beginning of the second half, is just mind-boggling. Had Siena had maybe one or two more players that could have impacted the game that wouldn't have had to have them play all five of their starters, they could have gone toe-to-toe, potentially closing this one out and causing one of the biggest upsets we've ever seen. It's only been twice before that we have seen a 16 versus 1. The prospect of that seems almost impossible, especially when you consider the fact that all four of these number one seeds heading into this tournament are some of the highest ranked teams in the history of KenPom. But in the end, Duke was able to survive that game thanks to the effects of the Boozer brothers. But in general, that second half from Duke was a little bit less than what I kind of expected. I was expecting them to pretty much come out of the gate and just take it from there, but they slowly chipped away at them, knowing that Siena would eventually crack with the fact that, again, they pretty much had all five players playing for the entire game. But either way, it was a great showing from Siena. They showed a lot in that game against Duke, and once again, I'm excited for the prospect of McNamara going forward with his Syracuse job. But now I want to talk a little bit about their second round opponents, being the TCU Horned Frog. Them and Ohio State started off this first round with an absolute banger. I mean, this was just a fun game in general, seeing TCU dominate in that first half before Ohio State came crawling back in. Big shout out goes to David Punch for this one. He was just unstoppable in that one. 16 points, 13 rebounds, and getting the game-winning assist to Xavier Edmonds with a few seconds to go. But otherwise, I was a little bit disappointed from Ohio State, especially the guard play of John Mobley and Bruce Thornton. They could only combine for 25 points in between them, and Thornton, outside of that big shot that he hit at the end to tie the game, wasn't able to deliver on that last shot. It was a bit of a shame that his Ohio State career came to the end that it did, but in the end, I think TCU deserved the win. And I'll give them credit as well for playing a pretty good first half as well with Duke before they just ran out of it in the second half. That version of Duke is the one that we've more so come to expect from them, just a dominant second half from them. Even Patrick Ngumba in the minutes that he played was still very impactful for them. And of course, Cam Boozer in those two games did his thing, as he usually does. His game against Siena was a bit underwhelming for his standards, which is crazy to say because he still had 22 points and 13 rebounds. But in the TCU game, he looked a lot more like himself, and I think that's the kind of version that we'll see from Cameron Boozer. Either way, though, just judging off these first two games, I knew it wasn't really going to be an easy ride for Duke. I'm more so shocked that that first game was even close as it was, but they did look a lot better in that second game, which gives me a little bit more, I don't want to say hope, but it gives me a little bit more assurance that Duke can still be a team that can make a good run, but it's only going to get harder from here, especially when talking about the potential opponents that they're going to have in the later rounds. And it's time that we talk about their opponents that they're about to face in the Sweet 16, being the St. John's Red Storm. I had pretty modest expectations for this team coming into the tournament, especially considering the level of competition that they'd be coming up against. But as of now, they have completely raised to that challenge. I don't think I went into this as deep as I kind of wanted to in the previous video, but they were really underseeded as a 5 seed. I'm not sure you could really take a look at their resume from what they've done. A team that won 19 of their last 20 games heading into the tournament, including a dominant win against UConn in the Big East tournament, and sticking them as a 5 seed in quite easily the toughest region of the tournament. But as of now, they've responded to that call. And all credit goes to, of course, the Godfather himself, Rick Pitino, finally getting back to the Sweet 16 for the St. John's team. And again, what did I say before the tournament? Zuby Ejiofor is going to be a player to get to know for March Madness, and he has been absolutely incredible. Seeing him in the first 4 minutes picking up 94 feet against Northern Iowa, then giving Flory Badunga that work against Kansas. But of course, we can't talk about that game without talking about the heroics of Dylan Darling. scoring his first buckets of the game with that game-winning buzzer-beating layup. Just an incredible moment for him to send St. John's to their first Sweet 16 in over 25 years. But I think the best part of that has to be Pitino's reaction right after. Guy's just not even phased looking at that game winner. And of course, Darling's response after the game, seeing that Pitino was yelling at him, saying, yeah, that's what usually happens. But shout out to St. John's, man. They've really, really impressed me in this tournament, and I cannot wait for that Duke game. That is going to be a crazy, crazy game. But before we move on to the rest of the region, I want to talk a little bit about Kansas. I know I had a lot to say about them in the previous video about what kind of version we would get from them. And honestly, that was kind of what it was. Kansas would just change up their version, it felt like, from a minute-to-minute, half-to-half basis. We saw that in the second half of the Cal Baptist game where they nearly choked a 26-point lead as they went on an 18-2 run, almost coming back from that. And then in the St. John's game, they started off very, very slow, down 14, made that big comeback at the end, but still ended up falling short. And I want to talk a little bit about that last sequence of that game, particularly with Kansas and their foul selection. I don't think I've ever used that word in my life, to be honest, but I mean, that's how it really came down at the end of the game. The team electing to use all of their fouls pretty much while still giving St. John's plenty of time on the clock to get a shot, which they obviously did. The strategy itself wasn't bad. I mean, if you have all those fouls, you definitely want to be able to use them. But in the way that it was executed was what really cost them in the end. But overall, I mean, if you are a Kansas fan or just in general, how do you really evaluate this year? Do you take it as a big failure considering you had one of the top players and a decent enough supporting cast around him? Not saying it's obviously the best that they could have put together, but still competent enough to be able to potentially do something, and we saw that throughout points of the season. Or do you take all that outside noise and things like that into account and still crediting the team for what they've done, still getting a win in March, and taking a criminally underrated St. John's team to the brink? And the same could also be evaluated for a guy like Darren Peterson, who I thought had a solid tournament, nothing crazy for his standards or the expectations that he had, but nothing that should deter anyone away from thinking that he's not one of the top players in the country, let alone one of the top players heading into this NBA draft. While his efficiency did take a step back in that second half or that closeout part of the year, I think a lot of that can be pointed out to the fact that he wasn't really able to develop a rhythm in a game-to-game or possession-by-possession basis. But at the end of the day, it's clear that when you watch the guy, he is one of the best shot makers that we have seen in a long, long time. And if a team can be able to put things right with him, and if he can be able to get his situation right, he is going to be an absolute problem. Obviously, I wish things worked out better for him in Kansas. I really wish that this team could have done more than they ended up doing. But at the end of the day, there's probably a lot of things that were out of his control, whether it's, physical things, mental things that he kind of alluded to after the game and after the season ended. Darren Peterson could easily put all that stuff behind him and go on to have a really, really great career, as is Kansas, if they can go on and bounce back and do much better things in seasons to come. Whether it'll involve Bill Self or not, time will tell. But now moving on to the south part of the Eastern region bracket as we go on to some teams like Louisville. First things first, I got to say, shout out to Pat Kelsey. I underestimated your game because I didn't think Louisville would be doing anything significant in March with the absence of Mikel Brown Jr. But against what a lot of people were picking as one of the main upset picks in South Florida, Louisville was able to get it done. It obviously wasn't a pretty game, but at the end of the day, that's pretty much the best that they could do with the team that they had. Big shout out to Isaac McNeely for stepping up in that one with 23 points. And I would have loved to see them potentially cause a big upset against Michigan State, but that was honestly just too much to ask. For them, it's just been business as usual. Cohen Carr's been really strong so far in this tournament. And then Jeremy Fears, even though he hasn't shot the ball particularly well in these two games, he's been really dominant from the playmaking side of things and just being the pest that he is. But overall for Louisville, they are one of many teams in this tournament that I look at and think of what they could have accomplished or what they could have potentially done if they had their best player healthy for the tournament. And to close out this East region, we had UCLA and UConn being advancing from their first round matchups. Both teams having somewhat scares in their first round matchups. UCLA winning a close one against UCF. And UConn having that first round scare against Furman, but they definitely stepped it up against UCLA. Shout out to Alex Karaban, just dominant from him in these two games so far. And that sets up an incredible matchup between them and Michigan State. Hurley versus Izzo. You know there's not going to be a moment of silence from those two coaches in that one. But that about does it for the East region. As far as who I could see coming out of this one, I'm going to stick with my original pick in UConn. I think UConn could get it done against Michigan State. I think, again, what we've seen from guys like Alex Karaban so far And I think there's a chance that Duke could potentially fall short against St. John's. Obviously, their health will come into play and Gumbo will be a lot more rested. Foster could potentially be in the equation now too. But I think St. John's could be a team that could also sneak their way into a potential Final Four. Who knows? They've had success in the past against UConn. Obviously, 2 weeks ago in the Big East tournament, they dominated them there. So that would probably be a matchup that they would want to see potentially once again. But either way, this region is not disappointed as far as the games that we've seen so far. We've seen buzzer beaters, close games, even close upsets. And as I predicted, we've seen some incredible coaching duels. Self and Pitino going at it. Now Pitino against Jon Scheyer's Duke. And of course, Hurley and Izzo, the pair of them going against one of obviously Duke or St. John's. It's been an incredible watch so far from this East region. And I can't wait to see what more magic they end up producing in these next couple of days. All right, now moving on to the West region where, of course, the Arizona Wildcats, the leading team of this one. My championship pick for this year, and so far, I can't say that they've disappointed. They obviously took care of business right away against LIU, handling them in their first round matchup. And then waiting for them was obviously Utah State, who I predicted would get that 9-8 upset against Villanova. And I was kind of surprised how that game played out because Villanova almost had a perfect shooting performance, and yet it still was nowhere really near enough. And then against Arizona, they were really able to push them to the brink until Braden Burris hit that ridiculous three-pointer that pretty much just put the game away. But to sum it up so far, I'd say I like what I'm seeing so far from Arizona. I'm definitely still sticking with them as my championship pick. I think, again, down the stretch of this tournament, that deep roster and that deep collection of players is really going to come through for them. But things got real interesting in this region when we saw the first major upset take place with High Point taking down Wisconsin. Now, someone that's been riding with Wisconsin all year, parading them as one of the more underrated teams in the nation, I was really disappointed to see them go early. But considering that the circumstances and how everything played out, as well as the team itself that they got beat by, I'm not that disappointed. Because High Point were just an incredible watch and just such a fun team, easy to like. The Chase Johnson story as well easily sticks out as one to remember going forward. I mean, the guy now has more threes in college than Steph Curry does. And he hit some ridiculous ones in that game. Ones that, if had gone out, would have probably meant game over. And then, of course, hitting his first 2-pointer of his career ended up being the game-winning bucket, which was just cinema to watch. And I was happy to see that, considering that pretty much ended up being one of the only, I guess, major upsets of the tournament. But I was also really happy to see them take it to Arkansas as well in their next game. Once again, Rob Martin and Cameron Fletcher causing all kinds of problems for Calipari. But in the end, of course, he has Darius Acuff, who from an offensive standpoint has just been absolutely ridiculous, not just in this tournament, but even going back a couple of weeks to the SEC tournament, as well as down the stretch of the regular season. I mean, going through his last 6 games, going back to the final game of the regular season yet against Texas, he's had 28, 37, 24, 30, 24, 36 from a freshman guard. I'll save the overall evaluations part of Darius Acuff when we get to that point in like a month or two from now. But as far as the run that he's been on with this Arkansas team, it's been just so fun to watch. There's a reason why this guy's in conversations for being one of, if not the best guard that Calipari has ever coached. Crazy that it only took him 2 years to be able to find that in his new home in Arkansas. But obviously for them now, that sets up a big time matchup with the number 1 seed Arizona in the Sweet 16. They'll definitely need the contributions from him, along with guys like Malik Thomas, Billy Richmond, Trayvon Brazile, and Malik Ewan as well, who's had a pretty solid tournament so far, averaging 15 points and 12 rebounds. But now moving on to the southern part of the West bracket, where the standout in this for me has to be the Texas Longhorns. A team that has played 3 games in the space of 5 days, and with their best player not scoring more than 15 points, has somehow managed to find their way to the Sweet 16. A team that many people said didn't even belong in the tournament because of their lackluster regular season has now gone further than teams like Florida and Vanderbilt. It's a tremendous run that they've been on, and all credit goes to obviously their head coach Sean Miller. Again, the same coach that knocked them out last year in the first 4 when he was coaching Xavier. He has now helped this program now complete turnaround of this season, and now to their first Sweet 16 in the last couple of years, when no one expected them to even be close to getting here. I'll start back from that first 4 matchup against NC State. A back and forth game. NC State obviously coming back into it in the end. But of course, Tremont Mark just completely saved the day for them, hitting 2 big-time shots, that 3, and of course that game-winning fadeaway jumper. And against BYU, Mark was a standout once again with 19 points, big shots again down the stretch. Vukatitis with a monster game. And despite AJ Dubanta going nuclear with 35 points, we were able to hold the rest of that BYU team to just 36. And in the Gonzaga game, it was kind of the same thing with Graham Mike taking a lot of the control on offense while no one else really was able to step up. And again, all of this has been done without a crazy performance from their star in Dalen Swain. If you asked me before the tournament if Texas were even going to get close to this kind of run, I would have thought that Dalen Swain would have turned into a top 5 player in the country. But that hasn't even been the case. But having said that, though, I like the approach that Texas and Sean Miller has really taken to these games. They've taken a lot more of a balanced attack, having guys like Vukatitis, Tremont Mark, Nick Pope. We saw him have a big game last game. And of course, Swain coming in ins and outs with scoring and just providing an all-around presence like he usually does. And I'll be interested to see if they can keep this run going against Purdue, another team that has carried their late season momentum into this tournament, getting a big win against Queens in the first round and surviving a tough Miami team coming off a big win against Missouri, a game that I thought, despite being the better team, might be up against it when it comes to the logistics side. But they obviously showed out on that one and gave Purdue a pretty good fight in that second round. But in the end, that sets up a 2 versus 11 in the Sweet 16. All right, now moving on to the South region, where the big story in this one has to be the early exit from the Florida Gators. It's not going to be a repeat of last year where all number 1 seeds made the Final Four and the Florida Gators were the ones that came out on top. Now, in my bracket, I predicted that the Florida Gators would go into the Sweet 16 and lose to Vanderbilt, the same team that beat them in the SEC tournament just a few weeks ago. But in the end, both of those teams are going to the Sweet 16. Florida was knocked out even earlier by who else but the Iowa Hawkeyes. Of all teams to do it, it was Iowa. And it wasn't like Bennett Sturts had a crazy game like how I thought it would somewhat go in my head. But obviously, it was Bennett Sturts that made that game-winning play, that big pass to Alvaro Figueres who hit that huge corner 3. But it is a disappointing end for the Florida Gators, considering how well they finished off the regular season and how much they looked like their old selves again. In the end, once again, they showed how hard it is in any sport, let alone just college basketball, to go back-to-back. Besides that, though, another team that I want to talk about that I think has been really impressing me so far throughout this tournament has been Nebraska. The team that before this tournament had never won a single game in March Madness all of a sudden finds itself in a really good position. After taking out Troy in their first game thanks to an incredible performance from Price Sandfort, they took down a highly touted Vanderbilt team led by Tyler Tanner in an incredibly dramatic fashion, with Braden Frager hitting what would be the game-winning layup before Tyler Tanner almost hit what would have been one of the greatest shots in March Madness history. But all credit goes to Tyler Tannerman. He was amazing in this tournament, amazing throughout the entire year, and I definitely felt bad for him not hitting that shot, especially because earlier in the season he had a similar shot like that basically did the exact same thing, rimming out, hitting the rim multiple times before bouncing out. And again, considering what preceded that game with Florida losing to Iowa, this game was a massive opportunity for both teams to solidify themselves in a potential deep run. But again, shout out to Nebraska. They've been a great story all year, and they've just been playing with house money, and they'll continue to ride on into the Sweet 16 and potentially further than that. Now onto the bottom half of the South. Now onto the bottom half of the South region, where this region was highlight. Now onto the bottom half of the South region, where the highlight of this has to be VCU's incredible comeback against UNC. They were down by 19 points with just 15 minutes to go, and VCU somehow turned it all around and won in overtime. And they can thank Terrence Hill Jr. for that, who went absolutely bonkers in that one with 34 points, including a ridiculous 3 to give them the lead, which they wouldn't see off to the end. And although I do want to put UNC in that same sort of tier of teams that wonder what they could have accomplished had they had a healthy Caleb Wilson for the last month or so stretch of the season. But even with those circumstances in the mix, that loss just cannot happen. Now, I'll start by saying that it wasn't completely out of the cards for them to lose this game in the first place. However, the manner in which it happened is what really concerns me. Again, regardless if your best player is healthy or not, that's a game that you should have. A 19-point lead with 15 minutes to go, you should easily be able to see that off. But it's safe to say now that Hubert Davis has been the cause of 2 of UNC's worst chokes in recent memory. That championship final against Kansas in 2022, and now this one against VCU. And obviously a lot's been made about his potential job security. There's still plenty of things up in the air, whether, what could potentially come next for UNC, who their potential replacement be if he does go out the door. It's tough because Hubert Davis was really chosen by Roy Williams as to be the next guy up to really carry the mantle and carry UNC forward. And I can't sit up here and act like he's done a horrible job at all aspects. He's been an expert when it comes to recruiting top players, as we've seen over the last couple of years. Caleb Wilson this year. Next year, Dylan Mingo they've recruited. Even getting guys like Henry Visar through the portal. But again, you really just can't look past that. And considering the fact that in the second half and beyond, he only had 6 players feature on the court. I get that the team is banged up, especially with the loss of Caleb, but that just can't happen. It's as simple as that. For a team like UNC, with the reputation that they have as a blue blood team, for them to go out and choke a 19-point lead against VCU is just crazy. And it's not like the team was completely poor. Henry Visar stepped up throughout the last part of that year. Seth Trimble as well, even though he had that last play at the end there. He's been a guy for them all year. And again, this wasn't a game that was completely out of the cards for UNC to lose. The fact that them losing the game isn't necessarily the problem. That was always going to be a potential outcome. But it's the matter of which it happened that really leaves a sour taste in the mouths of UNC faithful. But apart from that, everything was business as usual for the rest of the teams in here, with Illinois and Houston making it out. A&M got the upset win against St. Mary's, another one that I saw coming. I think A&M, a team that has faced significantly better competition than St. Mary's throughout the year. And again, it's been a pattern with St. Mary's for the last couple of years. Their lack of competition has really, really hurt them when it comes to their play into the tournament. But obviously A&M couldn't keep that up against Houston, who just, again, stayed really, really solid throughout the tournament. That sets up an incredible Sweet 16 game between them and Houston. I still want to back Illinois in that one, but again, Houston is just a phenomenal, phenomenal team, and I could easily see them really taking it to Illinois and potentially not even making this close. But again, if Illinois do the right things, they hit their shots, they really keep that momentum up, and they don't chase the game, I think they'll be able to pull it off. But overall, this has been a really fun region. Probably the most fun region when it comes to some of the crazy upsets that we've seen. But again, I think this region will probably be decided by that big game against Illinois and Houston. I think whoever wins that game could potentially, at this point, be a shoo-in for not only just a Final Four, but potentially the championship final. Now on to the last region. That is, of course, the Midwest. So far, it's been dominated by a lot of people's tournament favorite this year, and that being the Michigan Wolverines. They did have a pretty close first half in their first round game against Howard before they pulled away, but they looked a lot more like themselves in that second game against St. Louis, especially in that second half with Yaxel Lendenborg just completely taking over. I watched this game and the Michigan State-Louisville game live in Buffalo, and I gotta say, Yaxel has definitely earned his right to be called one of the best players in the country. He's been just a force. And again, I just love how balanced this Michigan team is, really from all aspects. From an offensive standpoint, you have guys that can run to the rim, knock down threes. The movement as well from everyone is also just really, really smooth. And of course, defensively as well, they're really, really stout, especially having a guy like Ade Mara protecting the paint in there. Even Elliot Cadeau in a lot of those possessions really stood out defensively as well. And that really intrigues me in their next matchup as they face Alabama. Two teams that have sort of similar kind of philosophies when it comes to how they run offenses. Just declining the mid-range jumper, going all in for rim runs and three-point attempts. But I think the main difference there is obviously Michigan's top-notch defense, which we've seen throughout the tournament so far. But it'll definitely face a big test against the high-powered Alabama offense, which we've seen it throughout their first 2 games. It is lethal. In particular, their last game against Texas Tech, they just could not miss from downtown. I went into that game expecting a big point guard duel between Christian Anderson and LeBaron Filan, and I'm not going to lie, I was pretty underwhelmed from both of them in terms of none of them had crazy games. Obviously, LeBaron was much better than Christian Anderson, who really struggled to get really anything going for Texas Tech, versus LeBaron, who we got to see him impact the game in more ways than just scoring the ball. His playmaking was on point, and of course, he managed to hold down Christian Anderson, although they were giving him different looks throughout the game. And of course, again, Alabama just did all the right things in that one. They played in a way that you expect a team to play when they don't really have another secondary scorer. They just find the open man, and they let it ride. And that's exactly what got them through in that one. And the Hofstra game as well. Although that one felt a lot more like the LeBaron Filan show than compared to what we saw in Texas Tech. But so far, I gotta say, from an offensive standpoint, Alabama have definitely really coped well with the loss of Aiden Holloway. I can't imagine how much of a sudden change that was for them, having a guy that's been so consistent for them as their second option all of a sudden be just gone days before the tournament. But again, they've gotten 90 points in back-to-back games, and their shot's been looking good so far. Obviously, they're going to face a big test now with Michigan, one of the top defenses. That's where I think not having a guy like Aiden Holloway is really going to hurt. I don't know, man. If LeBaron turns up and he gives them their best, I could really see Alabama giving them a game. But again, Texas Tech is going to be one of those teams that I look back on this year and think, what could they have done had they had JT Toppin for this stretch of the season. Not saying it'd be completely different, but I genuinely think with a healthy JT Toppin, with the way that they were coming in before, beating teams like Arizona and Duke in the earlier part of the season, they really could have done something big. Now onto the other half of the bracket where we saw Miami of Ohio get their first 4 win against SMU. They actually made, looking back, I think the first 4 was probably a good spot for Miami of Ohio to be in. You obviously want them to be in the tournament, but still kind of want to prove themselves. And that's what they did. They got a big win against SMU. But in the end, either way, I think whether them or SMU winning that game, Tennessee was going to win that either way. They're just too strong of a team. And I've been really impressed in particular with Jacoby Gillespie. He was so good in that game. 29 points, 9 assists, 6 threes. He was just awesome in that one. And then he stepped up again in the Virginia game with 21 in that one as well. He just continues to be one of my favorite guards in the country. I can't even lie. I'm glad to see him continue this success coming from the Crab 5 team last year in Maryland that went to the Sweet 16. Now he's leading this Tennessee team to this point. Virginia were another one of those teams where I almost thought they were going to experience another first-round upset of Wright State, who really was able to hang with them the whole way until that last stretch of the game where they just pulled away. And another thing I want to talk about from this region has to be the game between Kentucky and Santa Clara, which I think will go down as a certified March classic. I mean, that last sequence alone belongs in the College Basketball Hall of Fame for just absolute insanity. All within 10 seconds, we saw Oweh tie the game. Graves got what looked like was going to be the game-winning 3 before Oweh just sends an absolute prayer and sinks it from half court, tying the game at 73. To think that in about 10 seconds, the game went from 70 to 68 for Santa Clara to 73 to 73 going to overtime is just all you need to know about March Madness basketball. And again, Otega Oweh was just an absolute hero for Kentucky that game. He was doing everything in his power to get them that game, and he certainly did. 35 points, 8 rebounds, 7 assists. Of course, the clutch shots that he hit at the end, including that crazy one. What a display from him, and good for Kentucky to at least get something out of this season that's been otherwise pretty disappointing for their standards. And of course, they couldn't get it done against Iowa State in the next round. I'm a little bit concerned for Iowa State, though, with the status of Joshua Jefferson. It was good to see them have the performances that they did in their last 2 games without him, but I'm definitely going to be worried about him going forward throughout these next couple of games. It's obviously a shame that they lost him early in that game against Tennessee State, but we'll see what his status will look like as they take on Tennessee in the Sweet 16. But there you go. There's the recap of the first 2 rounds of March Madness. As far as my predictions for sort of how the rest of the tournament will go, it's honestly pretty similar to the ones that I had in the beginning, minus 1 or 2 teams that might be inserted in there. But as far as my Final Four, I'll keep it as I had it in the beginning. It'll be Arizona, Michigan, Illinois, and UConn. But again, who knows? It's March Madness. There's already things going crazy. Who knows what these next 2 rounds are going to look like? I cannot wait for it. Again, thanks for watching this video. March Madness has just been incredible to watch so far. I've had the privilege to even go to some of these games and just be a part of that whole atmosphere. It's just been so cool. But aside from this, I definitely want to do more videos. I know obviously World Cup stuff is going to be coming up in the playoffs in UEFA and across the world. I definitely want to talk about some of that, as well as some of the Champions League action and just regular things in general. And after that, we'll obviously be right around the corner for the NBA playoffs and things like that. So there's a lot going on, but yeah, right now I'm just having a ton of fun watching and going deep into this March Madness. And I hope you guys are having fun watching this as well. I hope your brackets are doing somewhat okay like mine, but still, it's it's March. What do you expect? But again, that's going to be it for this one. Thank you so much for watching, and until then, I'll see you next time.